Daniel, sign over your half of the house to your brother. He needs the stability more than you do. You've always been the responsible one. My aunt dropped that sentence over the phone like she was asking me to pass the salt. Behind her, I could hear my uncle murmuring in agreement. On the other end of the line, I sat in my car in the parking garage of the county courthouse, where I'd just filed a motion that took me 3 weeks to build. My hands were steady. My voice was steady. I said, "I'll think about it," and hung up. They thought that meant yes. It didn't. Have you ever been asked to shrink yourself so someone else could look bigger? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. My name is Diane. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was the family's invisible foundation. The one you build on top of but never look down at. My brother Colton is 34, 3 years older, and from the time he was about 12, my parents had quietly decided he was the one who mattered more. Not out loud. They never said it out loud, but it was in everything. The way my father would stay up until midnight helping Colton with a business plan for a school project but couldn't remember the name of my AP courses. The way my mother would drive 40 minutes each way to watch Colton's rec league baseball games but missed my college graduation because she said the traffic would be bad. I started working at 16. A hostess job at a steakhouse 2 towns over, 3 nights a week plus weekends. I saved everything I could. I had a goal that I didn't tell anyone about because I had already learned that goals, when shared with my family, became targets. By 19, I was working 2 jobs and taking night classes. By 23, I had my paralegal certification and was working at a real estate law firm in the city. By 26, I had passed the bar. Nobody in my family celebrated. My mother sent a card that said congratulations on finishing school. My brother texted a thumbs up. Around that same time, Colton was on his 3rd business idea. The first 2 had needed what he called seed money and what I called loans that never came back. He had a talent for sounding like he was about to make it. The vocabulary of success without the infrastructure under it. He talked about leverage and market positioning and scaling, and he said these words in the same tone that my father used to use when he talked about how far Colton would go one day. But here is what nobody talked about. Our parents owned a house, a real one. 3 bedrooms, paid off, in a neighborhood that had become considerably more valuable over the past 15 years. The kind of asset that takes a lifetime to build. My father had bought it in the late 90s for under $200,000. By the time I passed the bar, a similar house, 2 streets over, had sold for $640,000. My parents were in their late 60s by then. My father had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 2 years prior. My mother had her own health complications that I won't detail here out of respect, but the point is that they were aging and they knew it. There had been general family conversations, vague and uncomfortable, about what would happen to the house eventually. I assumed there would be a will. I assumed it would be handled like a normal family handles these things. I was wrong about a lot of things where my family was concerned. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in March. It was my aunt again, my mother's older sister, who has always functioned as a kind of amplifier for whatever my mother is feeling, but doesn't want to say herself. She called to let me know that my parents had decided to add Colton to the deed as a co-owner, 50%, immediately, because he was going through a hard time and needed something solid under him. What kind of hard time, I asked. His latest business had not worked out. He owed some money. He needed stability. I asked if I would also be added to the deed. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds too long. Your parents feel like you're doing well enough on your own, she said. Colton needs this more right now. I said I'd think about it and hung up. I sat in my car for a long time after that. I want to be honest about what I felt in those minutes because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. I wasn't heartbroken. I was past that. What I felt was a very cold and very specific clarity. The kind that only comes when something you suspected for years is finally confirmed in plain language. I had always known, somewhere underneath everything, that my parents saw Colton as the investment and me as the backup plan. This phone call was just the paperwork. What my aunt did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the previous 8 months working on a case involving contested property transfers in situations where one party lacked full cognitive capacity at the time of signing. I had become, not by accident, quite familiar with the legal standards around that. My father's Parkinson's diagnosis was documented. His neurologist visits were documented. His medication history was documented, and here is something that most people do not know but that I knew very well by that point. Cognitive capacity is not binary. It is not simply present or absent. It exists on a spectrum, and certain conditions, including early to moderate Parkinson's, can affect executive function and decision-making in ways that are clinically significant even when the person appears on the surface to be fine. I did not call my aunt back that night. I called my father's neurologist's office and left a message requesting his most recent assessment records. Then I called a colleague at a different firm, someone who specialized in elder law, and asked her to coffee. Over the next 6 weeks, I said almost nothing to my family. My mother called twice. I answered warmly, asked about her health, asked about my father, told her I was busy with a case. Which was true. I was busy with a case. I just didn't specify which one. The thing about a property transfer is that it leaves a paper trail. A clean one. Notarized signatures, county recording stamps, dates. These are public records. I pulled the filing myself through the county assessor's website on a Saturday morning, sitting at my kitchen table in sweatpants with a cup of coffee. The transfer had been executed 6 weeks prior. Colton's name was now on the deed as a joint tenant. The notarization date was a Thursday afternoon. I cross-referenced that date with my father's medical records, which I now had copies of. 3 days before the signing, my father had had a documented appointment with his neurologist. The clinical notes from that appointment included language I recognized immediately. Patient demonstrated word-finding difficulties and reduced processing speed. Discussed adjustment to medication dosage. Patient's wife present and engaged. Recommend follow-up in 30 days. I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I opened a new document and started writing. What I was building was a formal challenge to the validity of the transfer, on the grounds that my father lacked sufficient cognitive capacity to enter into a legally binding real property transaction at the time of signing. In plain language, the transfer might not be legal. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I am not saying my mother or my brother deliberately exploited my father. I am saying that they moved quickly, without involving me, during a period when my father was medically documented to be experiencing cognitive difficulties. Whether that was carelessness or something else, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that it was legally contestable. My colleague in elder law agreed. She reviewed everything I'd gathered and sat across from me at a corner table in the coffee shop near her office and said, "Diane, this is actually a strong position." I nodded. "I know." She looked at me for a moment. "How long have you been sitting on this?" "About 5 weeks." She nodded slowly. "You want to try mediation first or go straight to the filing?" "I want to go to mediation first," I said, not because I expected it to work, because I wanted there to be a record of the fact that I tried. I called my mother on a Sunday afternoon. I told her I had some concerns about the property transfer and that I'd like to have a conversation with the family, including Colton, before anything went further. I kept my voice even. I did not use legal language. I said I just wanted to make sure everyone understood what had been signed and that Dad had been in a good place when it happened. The response was not what I would call measured. My mother said I was jealous. She said I had always resented Colton's potential. She said my father had made this decision freely and that I was trying to undermine him. She said, and I wrote this down because I knew I would want to remember it exactly, "Your brother has real needs. You have a career. You'll be fine. You always figure it out." I thanked her for her time and told her I'd follow up in writing. That following up in writing part is where things became real. A formal letter went out through my colleague's office, not mine, because I wanted the appearance of distance. It outlined the basis for our concern, referenced the relevant neurological documentation, and requested a mediated conversation with all parties present, including an independent facilitator, within 30 days. My aunt called me 4 times that week. I did not pick up. Colton texted me a message that was long and wounded and used the phrase, "You're destroying this family 3 separate times." I read it, acknowledged it to myself, and did not respond. My mother left a voicemail that I will not repeat in full, but that included a suggestion that I had been difficult since childhood and that this was simply more of the same. I saved all of it. Every text, every voicemail, every email. I saved it in a folder on my desktop labeled simply, "Family." The mediation session happened on a Thursday morning in a beige conference room at a neutral location, a mediation center downtown that my colleague had used before. My mother came with my aunt. Colton came alone. He was wearing a jacket that still had a small crease down one sleeve from being folded in a box somewhere, And he sat across the table from me, and for a moment, I remembered us as kids, before everything calcified into what it became. He used to be funny. He used to do this thing where he'd imitate our father's voice at the dinner table, and all of us, including my father, would lose it laughing. I thought about that for exactly 2 seconds, and then I opened my folder. The mediator was a calm woman named Ellen who had clearly seen worse than us. She explained the process, established that everyone would have time to speak, and asked if there was anything anyone wanted to say before we began reviewing the documents. My mother said she wanted it on record that this was not what our family did, that we did not take each other to rooms like this, that I had always had a difficult relationship with being part of a family. I let her finish. Then I laid out what I had: the medical documentation, the timeline, the notarization date, and what my father's neurologist had written 3 days prior, the legal standard for cognitive capacity and property transactions in this state, the case law my colleague had pulled that showed similar transfers being invalidated under similar circumstances. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. Colton's face went through several stages while I was talking. The first was dismissal, a kind of practiced look I recognized from childhood, the look he used to use when he didn't want to be wrong about something. Then something shifted. He picked up the neurologist's notes and read them himself. He read them twice. When he put them down, he didn't look at me. He looked at the table. My mother said the neurologist was wrong. She said my father was perfectly sharp that week. She said I was weaponizing a diagnosis. Ellen, the mediator, gently noted that the documentation was what it was and that the question before us was how we wanted to proceed. What followed was a conversation that lasted 2.5 hours, and that I will not pretend was clean or easy or without real pain. My mother cried at one point. I did not, but not because I didn't feel anything. It was because I had already processed most of what I was feeling in those 6 weeks of silence. I had cried in my apartment, alone, more than once, at the particular grief of being right about people you love not loving you back the way you needed. That grief had already moved through me. What was left was just the work. By the end of the session, Colton had agreed to relinquish his claim on the deed in exchange for a formal agreement in which my parents would update their estate documents to reflect an equitable distribution between the two of us, reviewed by an independent elder law attorney. Neither mine nor anyone my family had used before. My mother did not agree easily, but Colton, to whatever credit applies here, looked at the documents and said, "Mom, I can't fight this." And she eventually stopped fighting it too. Outside the building afterward, Colton stopped me on the sidewalk. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked older than I remembered. He said, "I didn't know about Dad's appointment." I didn't know any of that. I looked at him. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. He said, "I should have asked. About the house. I should have called you first." "Yes," I said, "you should have." We didn't hug. We didn't make promises. But it was the most honest conversation we'd had in probably 15 years, and I counted that for something even if I wasn't sure yet what. The estate documents were updated 3 months later. An independent attorney oversaw the process. My father, by then, had stabilized somewhat on an adjusted medication regimen and was present for the signing and understood what he was signing. He looked at me across the table in that attorney's office and said, "I'm sorry we didn't do this right the first time. I almost came apart right there in that room. Almost. Instead, I put my hand over his and said, 'We're doing it right now.' The house stayed in my parents' names until they're ready to pass it on. Colton and I are both named in the will equally, with the process managed through an independent trustee. My aunt has not called me since the mediation. My mother and I are in what I would describe as a cautious, imperfect rebuilding. We have dinner on the first Sunday of every month. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's hard. I show up either way. Colton and I text occasionally. Nothing deep yet, but something. And my father? My father asks me sometimes about my cases. He asked me once without much context if I was happy. I told him I was getting there. He said that was the right answer. He said getting there was the honest one. I think about the version of this story where I didn't know what I knew, where I got that phone call and swallowed it the way I had swallowed things my whole life and just let it go because making noise felt like too much. I think about her, that version of me, and I feel a tenderness toward her that I don't always feel toward myself. She would have been fine. I know that. I have always figured it out. My mother was right about that much. But fine is not the same as whole. And I spent enough years being fine. I used to think that the hardest part of my story was what my family did. I know now that wasn't it. The hardest part was the years before. The ones where I absorbed the message quietly, where I worked 2 jobs and took night classes and told myself that if I just kept going, kept being the responsible one, something would eventually shift. It didn't shift on its own. Things like that rarely do. What I did in that beige conference room wasn't an act of revenge. I want to be clear about that because I think it's an easy story to tell wrong. I didn't build that folder because I wanted to hurt Colton or humiliate my mother. I built it because I had spent years watching what happens when you let things go unchallenged, when you swallow what's unfair and call it maturity. It doesn't make you mature. It just makes you smaller. The outcomes in this story followed from choices. My father's neurologist documented what he observed because that's what careful people do. Colton looked at the medical notes and said he couldn't fight it because the truth has a weight that performance can't match. Not permanently. My mother eventually stopped arguing because reality, given enough documentation, is very difficult to argue with. These things didn't happen to anyone. They followed directly from what people had done, including what I had done, which was prepare. I think about the word useful a lot. My family's version of useful was be available, don't make demands, absorb the cost without complaint. I spent a long time trying to fit that definition. The summer I was 19 and working a morning shift at a diner and an evening shift at a copy center, I thought I was building towards something they'd one day recognize. They didn't, because that was never what the arrangement was. Real usefulness, I've come to think, looks more like showing up with the documents. It looks like knowing the standard for cognitive capacity in a property transaction. It looks like calling a colleague and asking the uncomfortable question before you need the answer urgently. Wisdom isn't knowing a lot of things. It's knowing which things matter and having them ready when the moment arrives. Colton told me he didn't know about my father's appointment. I believe him. And that matters, because the opposite of wisdom isn't malice. Usually it's just the comfortable habit of not asking. Not asking if your sister knew. Not asking whether the timing was right. Not asking what the neurologist said last week. Colton coasted on assumptions about who needed what, and those assumptions cost him, not because the universe was punishing him, but because reality has a way of surfacing through paper trails and notarization dates and clinical notes from a Thursday afternoon. The thing about integrity is that it's mostly invisible while you're building it. Nobody hands you a certificate when you choose the harder path for the 10th time in a row. Nobody notices when you save the voicemails or keep the folder or sit with your grief in private for 6 weeks instead of making noise. But it compounds. Like anything built carefully over time, it becomes something you can walk into a room, carrying and set on a table, and have it speak for itself. My father said getting there was the honest answer. I think he was right. I'm not finished. But I'm further than I was, and I got here on my own terms. And that is the only version of arrival I've ever trusted.